After receiving a visit from the Queen Mother, Beechey was invited to a soirée given in his honor in the palace at Papeete. When the English arrived, however, they found everybody sound asleep, the hostess having forgotten all about her invitation and gone to bed earlier than usual. She received her guests none the less cordially, however, and organized a little dance in spite of the remonstrances of the missionaries. Only the fete had to be conducted, so to speak, in silence, that the noise might not reach the ears of the police on duty on the beach. From this incident, we can guess the amount of liberty the missionary Pritchard allowed to the most exalted personages of Otaheite. What must the discipline then have been for the common herd of the natives? On the 3rd April, the young king paid a visit to Beechey, who gave him, on behalf of the Admiralty, a fine fowling piece. Very friendly was the intercourse which ensued, and the good influence the English missionaries had obtained was strengthened by the cordiality and tact of the ship's officers. Leaving Otaheite on the 26th April, Beechey reached the Sandwich Islands, where he remained some 10 days, and then set sail for Bering Strait and the Arctic Ocean. His instructions were to skirt along the North American coast as far as the state of the ice would permit. The Blossom made a halt in Kotzebue Bay, a desolate, forbidding and inhospitable spot, where the English had several interviews with the natives without obtaining any information about Franklin and his people. At last Beechey sent forward one of the ship's boats under command of Lieutenant Elson to seek the intrepid explorer. Elson was, however, unable to pass Point Barrow N. lat. 71 degrees 23, and was compelled to return to the Blossom, which in her turn was driven back to the entrance of the strait by the ice on the 13th October, the weather being clear and the frost of extreme severity. In order to turn to account the winter season, Beechey visited San Francisco and cast anchor yet again off Honolulu in the Sandwich Islands. Thanks to the liberal and enlightened policy of the government, this archipelago was now rapidly growing in prosperity. The number of houses had increased, the town was gradually acquiring a European appearance, the harbour was frequented by numerous English and American vessels, and a national navy numbering 5 brigs and 8 schooners had sprung into being. Agriculture was in a flourishing condition. Coffee, tea, spices were cultivated in extensive plantations, and efforts were being made to utilize the luxuriant sugar-cane forests native to the archipelago. After a stay in April at the mouth of the Canton River, the explorers surveyed the Ryukyu archipelago, a chain of islands connecting Japan with Formosa, and the Barninsima group, districts in which no animals were seen but big green turtles. This exploration over, the Blossom resumed her northerly course, but the atmospheric conditions were less favorable than before, and it was impossible this time to penetrate further than N. lat. 70 degrees 40. Beechey left provisions, clothes and instructions on the coast in this neighborhood in case Perry or Franklin should get as far. The explorer then cruised about until the 6th October, when he decided with the greatest regret to return to England. He touched at Monterey, San Francisco, San Blas and Valparaiso, doubled Cape Horn, cast anchor at Rio de Janeiro, and finally arrived off Spithead on the 21st October. Amorai at Kayakakwa. Amorai at Kayakakwa. Facsimile of early engraving. We must now give an account of the expedition of the Russian Captain Luck, which was fruitful of most important results. The explorer's own relation of his adventures is written in a most amusing and spirited style, and from it we shall therefore quote largely. The Seniavin and the Malo were 2 transport ships built in Russia, both of which were good sea-going boats. The latter, however, was a very slow sailer, which unfortunately kept the 2 vessels apart for the greater part of the voyage. Luck commanded the Seniavin and Staniakowicz the Malo. The 2 vessels set sail from Kronstadt on the 1st September, 1828, and touched at Copenhagen and Plymouth, where scientific instruments were purchased. Hardly had they left the channel before they were separated. The Seniavin, whose movements we shall most particularly follow, touched at Tenerife, where Luck hoped to meet his consort. From the 4th to the 8th November, Tenerife had been devastated by a terrific storm such as had not been seen since the conquest. 3 vessels had perished in the very roadstead of Santa Cruz, and 2 others thrown upon the coast had gone to pieces. Torrents swollen by a tremendous downpour had destroyed gardens, walls and buildings, laid waste plantations, all but demolished 1 fort, swept down a number of houses in the town, and rendered several streets impassable. 300 or 400 persons had met their deaths in this convulsion of nature, and the damage done was estimated at several millions of piastres. In January the 2 vessels met again at Rio de Janeiro, and kept together as far as Cape Horn, where they encountered the usual storms and fogs, and were again separated. The Seniavin then made for Conception. On the 15th May, says Luck, we were not more than 8 miles from the nearest coast, but a dense fog hid it from us. In the night this fog lifted, and at daybreak a scene of indescribable grandeur and magnificence met our eyes. The serrated chain of the Andes, with its pointed peaks, stood out against an azure blue sky lit up by the first rays of the morning sun. I will not add to the number of those who have exhausted themselves in vain efforts to transmit to others their own sensations at the first sight of such scenes. They are as indescribable as the majesty of the scene itself, the variety of the colors, the light, which as the sun rose gradually spread over the sky, and the clouds were alike of inimitable beauty. To our great regret this spectacle, like everything most sublime in nature, did not last long. As the atmosphere became flooded with light, the huge masses of clouds seemed with one accord to plunge into the deep, and the sun, appearing above the horizon, removed every trace of them. Luck's opinion of Conception does not agree with that of some of his predecessors. He had not yet forgotten the exuberant richness of the vegetation of the Bay of Rio de Janeiro, so that he found this new coast poor. As far as he could judge, during a very short stay, the inhabitants were more affable and civilized than the people of the same class in many other countries. When he reached Valparaiso, Luck met the Mahler setting sail for Kamchatka. The crews bid each other goodbye, and thenceforth the two vessels took different directions. The first excursion of the officers and naturalists of Luck's party was to the celebrated quebradas. These, says the explorer, are ravines in the mountains, crowded so to speak with the little huts containing the greater part of the people of Valparaiso. The most densely populated of these quebradas is that rising at the southwest corner of the town. The granite, which is there laid bare, serves as a strong foundation for the buildings, and protects them from the destructive effects of earthquakes. Communication between the town and the different houses is carried on by means of narrow paths without supports or steps, which are carried along the slopes of the rocks, and on which the children play and run about like chamois. The few houses here belong to foreigners. Little paths lead up to them, and some have steps, which the Chileans look upon as a superfluous and altogether useless luxury. A staircase of tiled or palm branch roofs below and above an amphitheatre of gates and gardens present a curious spectacle. At first I kept up with the naturalists, but they presently brought me to a place where I could not advance or retire a step, which decided me to return with one of my officers, and to leave them there with a hearty wish that they might bring their heads back safely to our lodgings. As for myself, I expected to lose mine 1,000 times before I got down again. On their return from an arduous excursion, a few leagues from Valparaiso, the Marines were astonished at being arrested as they rode into the town by a patrol, who in spite of their remonstrances compelled them to dismount. It was Holy Thursday, says Luck, and from that day to Holy Saturday no one is here permitted under pain of a severe penalty either to ride, sing, dance, play on any instrument, or wear a hat. All business, work, and amusement are strictly forbidden during that time. The hill in the centre of the town with the theatre upon it is converted for the time being into a Golgotha. In the centre of a railed-in space rises a crucifix with numerous tapers and flowers about it, and female figures kneeling on either side, representing the witnesses of the Passion of our Lord. Pious souls come here to obtain absolution from their sins by loud prayers. I saw none but female penitents, not a single man was there amongst them. Most of them were doubtless very certain of obtaining the divine favour, for they came up playing and laughing, only assuming a contrite air when close to the object of their devotion, before which they knelt for a few minutes, resuming their pranks and laughter again directly they turned away. The intolerance and superstition met with by the visitors at every turn made the explorer reflect deeply. He regretted seeing so much force and so many resources, which might have promoted the intellectual progress and material prosperity of the country, wasted on perpetual revolutions. To Luck nothing less resembled a valley of paradise than Valparaiso and its environs. Rugged mountains, broken by deep quebradas, a sandy plain, in the centre of which rises the town, with the lofty heights of the Andes in the background, do not, strictly speaking, form an Eden. The traces of the terrible earthquake of 1823 were not yet entirely effaced, and here and there large spaces covered with ruins were still to be seen. On the 15th April, the Seniavin set sail for New Archangel, where she arrived on the 24th June, after a voyage unmarked by any special incident. The necessity for repairing the effects of the wear and tear of a voyage of 10 months and of disembarking the provisions for the company of which the Seniavan was the bearer, detained Captain Lutk in the Bay of Sitka for 5 weeks. This part of the coast of North America presents a wild but picturesque appearance. Lofty mountains clothed to their very peaks with dense and gloomy forests form the background of the picture. At the entrance of the bay rises Mount Edgecumbe, an extinct volcano 2,800 feet above the sea level. On entering the bay, the visitor finds himself in a labyrinth of islands, behind which rise the fortress, towers and church of New Archangel, which consists of but one row of houses with gardens, a hospital, a timber yard, and outside the palisades a large village of Kalach Indians. At this time the population consisted of a mixture of Russians, Creoles and Aleutians, numbering some 800 altogether, of whom 3/8 were in the service of the company. This population, however, fluctuates very much according to the season. In the summer almost everyone is away at the chase, and no sooner does autumn bring the people before they are all off again fishing. New Archangel does not offer too many attractions in the way of amusements. Truth to tell, it is one of the dullest places imaginable, inexpressibly gloomy, where autumn seems to reign all through the year except for 3 months, when snow falls continuously. All this, however, does not of course affect the passing visitor, and for the resident there is nothing to keep up his spirits but a good stock of philosophy or a stern determination not to die of hunger. There is a good deal of remunerative trade with California, the natives and foreign vessels. The chief furs obtained by Aleutians who hunt for the company are those of the otter, the beaver, the fox and the souslik. The natives also hunt the walrus, seal and whale, not to speak of the herring, the cod, salmon, turbot, lote, perch and soukles, a shellfish found in Queen Charlotte's Islands, used by the company as a medium of exchange with the Americans. As for these Americans, they seem to be all of one race between the 46th nth degrees of Enlat. Such at least is the conclusion to which we are led by the study of their manners, customs and languages. The Kalachs of Sitka claim a man of the name of Elk as the founder of their race, favoured by the protection of the raven, first cause of all things. For strange to say, this bird also plays an important part amongst the Kadiaks, who are Esquimaux. According to Lutk, the Kalachs have a tradition of a deluge and some fables which recall those of the Greek mythology. For the raven was regarded by these races with superstitious dread, as having the power of healing diseases, and see, trans. Their religion is nothing more than a kind of shamanism or belief in the power of the shamans or magicians to ward off diseases, and see they do not recognize a supreme god, but they believe in evil spirits, and in sorcerers who foretell the future, heal the sick, and transmit their office from father to son. They believe the soul to be immortal, and that the spirits of their chieftains do not mix with those of the common people. Slaves are slaves still after death. The far from consolatory nature of this creed is obvious. The government is patriarchal, the natives are divided into tribes, the members of which have the figures of animals as signs, after which they are also sometimes named. We meet for instance with the wolf, the raven, the bear, the eagle and sea. The slaves of the Kalachs are prisoners taken in war, and very miserable is their lot. Their masters hold the power of life and death over them. In some ceremonies, that on the death of a chief, for instance, the slaves who are no longer of use are sacrificed, or else their liberty is given to them. 5. The aim being to give up the slaves as property, it was a matter of indifference whether they were killed or set at liberty. Trans. Suspicious and crafty, cruel and vindictive, the Kalachs are neither better nor worse than the neighboring tribes. Hardened to fatigue, brave but idle, they leave all the housework to their wives, of whom they have many, polygamy being an institution amongst them. On leaving Sitka, Lutk made for Aunalashka. Ilialuk is the chief trading establishment on that island, but it only contains some 12 Russians and 10 Aleutians of both sexes. This island has a good many productions which tend to make life pass pleasantly. It is rich in good pastures, and cattle breeding is largely carried on, but it is almost entirely wanting in timber, the inhabitants being obliged to pick up the debris flung up by the sea, which sometimes includes whole trunks of cypress, camphor trees, and a kind of wood which smells like roses. At the time of Lutk's visit, the people of the Fox Islands had adopted to a great extent Russian manners and costumes. They were all Christians. The Aleutians are a hardy, kind-hearted, agile race, almost living on the sea. Since 1826, several eruptions of lava have caused terrible devastation in these islands. In May 1827, the Shishaldin volcano opened a new crater and vomited forth flames. Luck's instructions obliged him to explore St. Matthew's Island, which Cook had called Gore Island. The hydrographical survey was successful beyond the highest expectations, but the Russians could do nothing towards learning anything of the natural history of the island, for they were not allowed to land at all. In the meantime, the winter with its usual storms and fogs was rapidly drawing on. It was of no use hoping to get to Bering Strait, and Luck therefore made for Kamchatka after touching at Bering Island. He remained 3 weeks at Petropalovsky, which he employed in landing his cargo and preparing for his winter campaign. Luck's instructions were now to spend the winter in the exploration of the Caroline Islands. He decided to go first to Ulan Island, which had been discovered by the French navigator Duperrey. Here a safe harbour enabled him to make some experiments with the pendulum. On his way, Luck sought in vain for Kalana's Island in N lat. 26 degrees 9, W long, 128 degrees. He was equally unsuccessful in his search for Dexter and St. Bartholomew Islands, though he identified the brown coral group discovered by Butler in 1794, and arrived safely off Ulan on the 4th December. From the first, the relations between the natives of this island and the Russians were extremely satisfactory. Many of the former came on board, and showed so much confidence in their visitors as to remain all night, though the vessel was still in motion. It was only with great difficulty that the Seniavine entered Cockwell Harbour. Following the example of Duperrey, who had set up his observatory on the islet of Mataniel, Luck landed there and took his observations, whilst his people traded with the natives, who were, throughout his stay, peaceful, friendly and civil. To check their thieving propensities, however, a chief was kept as a hostage for a couple of days, and one canoe was burnt, these new measures being completely successful. "We are glad to be able to declare in the face of the world," says Luck, "that our stay of 3 weeks at Ulan cost not a drop of human blood, but that we were able to leave these friendly islanders without enlightening them further on the use of our firearms, which they looked upon as suitable only for the killing of birds. I don't think there is another instance of the kind in the records of any previous voyages in the South Seas." Native of Ulands. Native of Ulands. Facsimile of early engraving. After leaving Ulan, Luck had a vain search for the Musgrave Islands, marked on Krusenstern's map, and soon discovered a large island, surrounded by a coral reef which had escaped the notice of Duperrey, and is known as Puinipit or Pornabi. Some very large and fine canoes, each manned by 14 men, and some smaller ones worked by 2 natives only, soon surrounded the vessel. Their inmates, with fierce faces and bloodshot eyes, were noisy and blustering, and did a good deal of shouting, gesticulating, and dancing before they could make up their minds to trust themselves on board the Seniavine. It would have been impossible to land, except by force, as the native canoes completely surrounded the vessel, and when an attempt at disembarkation was made, the savages surrounded the ship's boat, only retiring before the warlike attitude of the sailors and a volley from the guns of the Seniavine. Luck had not time to examine thoroughly his discovery, to which he gave the name of the Seniavine Archipelago. The information he collected on the people of the Puinipit Islands is, therefore, not very trustworthy. According to him, they do not belong to the same race as those of Ulan, but resemble rather the Papuans, the nearest of whom are those of New Ireland, 700 miles away. After another vain search, this time for St. Augustine's Island, he sighted the Kora of Lowe's Vaharites, also called Seven, or Raven Island, discovered in 1773 by the Spaniard Felipe Thompson. The navigator next saw the Mortlock Archipelago, the old Luganer group, known to tours as the Lugullos, the people of which resemble those of Ulan. He landed on the principal of these islands, which he found to be one huge garden of cocoa palms and breadfruit trees. The natives enjoy a center degree of civilization. They weave and dye the fibers of the banana and coconut palms, as do those of Ulan and Puinipit. Their fishing tackle does credit to their inventive faculties, especially a sort of case constructed of small sticks and split bamboo canes, which the fish cannot get out of when once in. They also use nets of the shape of large wallets, lines, and harpoons. Their canoes, in which they spend more than half their lives, are wonderfully adapted to their requirements. The large ones, which are a very great trouble to build, and which are kept in sheds constructed specially for them, are 26 feet long, 2.5 wide and 4 deep. They are furnished with gimbals, the cross pieces being connected by a rafter. On the other side there is a small platform, 4 feet square and furnished with a roof, under which they are accustomed to keep their provisions. These pirogues have a triangular sail, which is made of matting woven from bandanus leaves, and is attached to 2 yards. In tacking about they drop the sail, and turn the mast towards the other end of the canoe, to which at the same time they have passed the fastening of the sail, so that the pirogue moves forward by its other extremity. Luck next sighted the Namuluk group, the inhabitants of which do not differ at all from the people of Lugana, and he proved the identity of Hagaloo Island, already described by Duperrey, with Quirosa. He then visited the Namnuito group, the first stratum of a number of islands, or of one large island which will some day exist in this part of the world. Luck, who was in want of biscuits and other articles, which he hoped to obtain at Guam, or from vessels at anchor in that port, now set sail for the Marian Islands, where he counted upon being able to repeat some new experiments with the pendulum, in which Freycinet had found an important anomaly of gravitation. 6. From numerous experiments, says Freycinet, with the pendulum collected at our observatory at Agagna in lat. 13 degrees 27 511, 5 N, at the level of the sea, and with the thermometer at plus 20 degrees centig, we were shown that the pendulum which, in the same circumstances, would make at Paris 86,400 oscillations in 24 mean solar hours would here make 86,295 osc. 13 in the same time. Trans. Great, however, was his surprise when he arrived to find not a sign of life at Guam. No flags waved above the 2 ports, the silence of death reigned everywhere, and but for the presence of a schooner at anchor in the inner harbour, it might have been a desert island. There was hardly anybody about on shore, and the few people there were half savage, from whom it was all but impossible to obtain the slightest information. Fortunately, an English deserter came and offered his services to Lutk, who sent him to the governor with a letter, which elicited a satisfactory reply. The governor was the same Medinella whose hospitality had been lauded by Kotzebue and Freycinet. There was, therefore, no difficulty in obtaining permission to set up an observatory, and to take to it the necessary provisions. The stay at Guam was, however, saddened by an accident to Lutk, who wounded himself severely in the thumb with his own gun when hunting. The repairing and refitting of the Seniavin, with the taking in of wood and water, delayed the explorer at Guam until the 19th March. During this time, Luck was able to verify the information collected 10 years ago by Freycinet in his stay of 2 months in the governor's own house. Things had not changed at all since the French traveller's visit. As it was not yet time to go north, Luck made for the Caroline Islands, via the Swedes Islands. The inhabitants seemed to him to be better made than their neighbours on the west, from whom, however, they differ in no other particulars. The Faralep, Uli, Ifuluk and Euripag Islands were successively examined, and on the 27th April the explorer started for the Bonin Islands, where he learnt that his exploration of that group had been anticipated by Beechey. He, therefore, took no hydrographical surveys. 2 of the crew of a whaling vessel, which had been shipwrecked on the coast, were still living at Bonin Sima. Since the rise of the great fisheries, this archipelago has been frequented by numerous whalemen, who here find a safe port at all seasons, plenty of wood and water, turtles for 6 months of the year, fish, and immense quantities of antiscorbutic plants, including the delicious Savoy cabbage. The majestic height and the vigour of the trees, says Lutk, the productions of the tropical and temperate zones, alternating with each other, bear witness at once to the fertility of the soil and the salubrity of the climate. Most of our vegetables and pot herbs, perhaps indeed, all of them would certainly flourish well, as would also wheat, rice and maize, nor could a better climate be desired for the cultivation of the vine. Domestic animals of every kind and bees would multiply rapidly. In a word, a small and industrious colony would shortly convert this little group into a fertile and flourishing settlement. On the 9th June, after a week's delay for want of wind, the Seniavin entered Petropolovsky, where it was retained taking in provisions until the 26th. A whole series of surveys were taken during this interval, of the coasts of Kamchatka, and of the Kodiak and Tichaukchai districts, interrupted, however, by visits to Karaghinsk Island, the Bay of St. Lawrence and the Gulf of Santa Cruz. During one of these visits, the captain met with a strange adventure. He had been for several days on a friendly footing with the Tichaukchais, whose knowledge of the people and customs of Russia he endeavoured to increase. These natives, he says, were friendly and polite, and endeavoured to pay back our jokes and tricks in our own coin. I softly patted the cheek of a sturdy Tichaukchai as a sign of kindly feeling, and suddenly received in return a box on the ear which knocked me down. Recovered from my astonishment, there I saw my Tichaukchai with a laughing face, looking like a man who has just given proof of his politeness and tact. He too had meant to give me merely a gentle tap, but it was with a hand only accustomed to deal with reindeer. The travellers were also witnesses of some proofs of the skill of a treacherous conjurer, or chairman who went behind a curtain, from which his audience soon heard a voice like the howl of a wild beast, accompanied by blows on a tambourine with a whalebone. The curtain then rose, revealing the sorcerer balancing himself, and accompanying his own voice with blows on his drum, which he held close to his ear. Presently he flung off his jacket, leaving himself naked to the waist, took a polished stone which he gave to Luck to hold, took it away again, and as he passed one hand over the other the stone disappeared. Then showing a tumour on his shoulder, he pretended that the stone was in it, turned over the tumour, extracted the stone from it, and prophesied a favourable issue of the journey of the Russians. The conjurer was congratulated on his skill, and a knife was given to him as a token of gratitude. Taking this knife in his hand, he put out his tongue and began to cut it. His mouth became full of blood, and he finally cut a piece of his tongue off and held the piece out in his hand. Here the curtain fell, probably because the skill of the professor of legerdemain could go no further. The people inhabiting the northeast corner of Asia are known under the general name of treacherous. This includes two races, one nomad like the Samoyeds, called the reindeer treacherous, the other, living in fixed habitations, called the sedentary treacherous. The mode of life, the physiognomy, and the very language of these two races differ. The idiom spoken by the sedentary treacherous has great affinity with that of the Esquimaux, whom they also resemble in their mode of building their huts and leather boats, and in the instruments they use. Sedentary treacherous. Sedentary treacherous. Luck did not see many reindeer treacherous, so that he could add nothing to the information obtained by his predecessors. He was of opinion, however, that they had been painted in unfairly gloomy colours, and that their turbulence and wildness had been grossly exaggerated. The sedentary treacherous, generally called namalos, spend the winter in sheds, and the summer in huts covered with skins. The latter usually each serve for several families. The sons and their wives, the daughters and their husbands, says the narrative, live together with their parents and vice versa. Each family occupies one division of the back part of the hut, curtained off from the others. The curtains are made of reindeer skins, sewn into the shape of a bell. They are fastened to the beams of the ceiling, and reach to the ground. With the aid of the grease they burn in cold weather, 2, 3, and sometimes more persons so warm the air with their breath in these hermetically sealed positions that all clothing is superfluous, even with the severest frost, but only treacherous lungs are fitted to respire in such an atmosphere. In the outer part of the hut cooking utensils, pottery, baskets, sealskin trunks and sea are kept. Here too is the hearth, if we can so call the spot where burn a few sticks of brushwood, painfully collected in the marsh, or when they are not to be obtained, whalebones floating in grease. Round about the hut on wooden dryers, black and disgusting-looking pieces of seal's flesh are exposed to view. These people lead a miserable life. They feed upon the half-raw flesh of seals and walruses hunted by themselves, or on that of whales flung up by the waves on the beach. The dog is the only domestic animal they possess, and they treat it badly enough, although the poor creatures are very affectionate and render them great services, now towing along their canoes, now dragging their sledges over the snow. After a second stay of 5 weeks at Petropalovsky, the Seniavin left Kamchatka on the 10th of November on its way back to Europe. Before reaching Manila, Luck made a cruise in the northern part of the Caroline archipelago, which he had not had time to visit during the preceding winter. He saw in succession the islands of Marilu, Falulu, Fayu, Namuniuto, Maga, Faralep, Eep, Mogmog, and found at Manila the sloop, the Malo, which was waiting his arrival. The Caroline archipelago embraces an immense space, and the Marian Islands, as well as the Radak group, might fitly be included in it, as containing a population perfectly identical in race. For a long time the old geographers had had for their guidance only the charts of missionaries who, lacking alike the education and the appliances necessary to estimate accurately the size, position, and relative distance of all these archipelagos, had attached notable importance to them, and often fixed at a considerable number of degrees the extent of a group, which covered only a few miles. Thus navigators accepted their guidance with wise caution. Freycinet was the first to infuse a little order into this chaos, and thanks to his meeting with Cadu and Don Louis Tours, he was able to identify later with earlier discoveries. Luck did his part, and that not a small part, in the settling of an accurate and scientific chart of an archipelago which had long been the terror of navigators. the learned Russian explorer is not of the same opinion as Lesson, one of his predecessors, who connected all the inhabitants of the Caroline group with the Mongolian race under the name of the Mongolo-Pelagian branch. He rather sees in them, as did Chamisso and Balbai, a branch of the Malay family, which has peopled eastern Polynesia. Whilst Lesson compares the people of the Carolines with the Chinese and Japanese, Luck, on the other hand, finds in their great, projecting eyes, thick lips and retrousse nose, a family likeness to the people of the Sandwich and Tonga Islands. The language does not suggest the slightest comparison with Japanese, whilst it shows a great resemblance to that of the Tonga Islands. Luck spent the time of his sojourn at Manila in laying in stores and repairing the sloop, and on the 30th of January, he left that Spanish possession for Russia, which he reached on the 6th of September, 1829, casting anchor in the roads of Kronstadt. It remains now to tell how it had fared with the sloop the Marler after the separation at Valparaiso. Arriving at Kamchatka from Otaheite, she had left part of her cargo at Petropalovsky, and thereafter, in August 1827, had set sail for Unalashka, where she had remained for a month. After an examination of the west coast of America, which was cut short by unfavorable weather, and a stay at Honolulu, which extended to February 1828, she had discovered the island Marler, noted the Necker, Gardner and Lisiansky Islands, and marked at a distance of 6 miles southwards a very dangerous reef. The sloop had then coasted the island of Cure, the French frigate Shoal the Reef Marrow, Pearl Island and the Isle of Hermes, and after having made search for several islands marked upon Arrowsmith's charts, had at length reached Kamchatka. At the end of April, she had set sail for Unalashka and taken observations of the north coast of the Alaska Peninsula. In September, the Marler rejoined the Seniavin, and from that period until their return to Russia, they were no more separated, save for brief intervals. As one may judge from the sufficiently detailed account which has just been given, this expedition did not fail to bring about results of importance to geographical science. We must add that the different branches of natural history, physics, and astronomy owe to it equally numerous and important additions. Chapter 2. French Circumnavigators. The journey of Freycinet, Rio de Janeiro and its gypsy inhabitants, the Cape and its wines, the Bay of Sharks, stay at Timor-Ambe Island and its cannibal inhabitants, the Papuan Islands, the piled dwellings of the Ulfoas, a dinner with the governor of Guam, description of the Marian Islands and their inhabitants, particulars concerning the Sandwich Islands, Port Jackson and New South Wales, shipwreck in Berkeley Sound, the Falkland Islands, return to France, the voyage of the Coquille under the command of Duperrey, Martin Vaz and Trinidad, the island of St. Catherine, the independence of Brazil, Berkeley Sound and the remains of the Uranie, stay at Conception, the civil war in Chile, the Araucanians, discoveries in the dangerous archipelago, stay at Otaheite and New Ireland, the Papuans, stay at Yulan, the Caroline Islands and their inhabitants, scientific results of the expeditions. The expedition under the command of Louis-Claude de Saulces de Freycinet was the result of the leisure which the peace of 1815 brought to the French navy. The idea was started by one of its most adventurous officers, the same who had accompanied Baudin in his survey of the Australian coasts, and to him was entrusted the task of carrying it out. It was the first voyage which had not hydrography alone for its object. Its chief aim was to survey the shape of the land in the southern hemisphere, and to make observations in terrestrial magnetism, without, at the same time, omitting to give attention to all natural phenomena, and to the manners, customs, and languages of indigenous races. Purely geographical inquiries, though not altogether omitted from the programme, had the least prominent place in it. Among the medical officers of the Navy, Freycinet found Coy, Gaimard, and Gaudichaud, whose attainments in natural history qualified them for being valuable coadjutors, and he also chose to accompany him several distinguished officers who had risen to high rank in the Navy, the best known being Duperrey, Lamarche, Berard, and Audit Pellion, who subsequently became, one a member of the Institute, the others superior officers or admirals. No less care was exercised by Freycinet in composing his crew chiefly of sailors who were also skilled in some trade, so that out of the 120 men who manned the corvette Uranie, no less than 50 could serve on occasion as carpenters, rope-makers, sail-makers, blacksmiths, or other mechanics. The Uranie, amply supplied with stores for 2 years, and provided with all sorts of apparatus of proved utility, iron cisterns for fresh water, machines for distilling salt water, preserved provisions, remedies for scurvy, and see at last, on the 17th of September 1817, she set sail from Toulon. On board, disguised as a sailor, was the commander's wife, who was not to be deterred from joining her husband by the dangers and hardships of so protracted a voyage. Together with all these provisions for bodily comfort, Freycinet took with him a stock of the best scientific instruments, together with minute instructions from the Institute intended to direct his researches and to suggest the experiments best adapted to promote the progress of science. The Uranie reached Rio de Janeiro on the 6th of December, having put in at Gibraltar, and made a short stay at Tenerife, one of the Canaries, which, as Freycinet wittily observes, were not fortunate islands for his crew, all communication with the land being forbidden by the governors. During their stay at Rio de Janeiro, the officers took a great many magnetical observations and made experiments with the pendulum, whilst the naturalists scoured the country for new specimens and curiosities, making large and important collections. The original records of the voyage contain a long narrative of the discovery and colonization of Brazil, and detailed information on the customs and manners of the people, on the temperature and the climate, as well as a minute description of the principal buildings and the suburbs of Rio de Janeiro itself. The most curious part of this account is that which touches upon the gypsies, who at that time were to be met with at Rio de Janeiro. Worthy descendants of the pariahs of India, whence these gypsies without doubt originally came, says Freycinet, they are noted like their ancestors for every vicious practice and criminal propensity. Most of them, possessing immense wealth, make a great display in dress and in horses, especially at their weddings, which are celebrated with much expense, and they find their chief pleasure either in riotous debauchery or in sheer idleness. Knaves and liars, they cheat as much as they can in trade, and are also clever smugglers. Here, as elsewhere, these detestable people intermarry only among their own race. They speak a jargon of their own with a peculiar accent. The government most unaccountably tolerates the nuisance of their presence, and goes so far as to appropriate to their exclusive use 2 streets in the neighbourhood of the Campo de Santa Ana. A little further on, the traveller remarks, anyone who saw Rio de Janeiro only by day would come to the conclusion that the population consisted entirely of Negroes. The respectable classes never go out except in the evening, unless compelled by some pressing circumstance or for the performance of religious duties, and it is in the evening that the ladies especially show themselves. During the day all remain indoors, and pass the time between their couches and their looking-glasses. The only places where a man can enjoy the society of the ladies are the theatres and the churches. During the sail from Brazil to the Cape of Good Hope nothing occurred deserving special mention. On the 7th March the Uranie anchored in Table Bay. After a quarantine of 3 days, the travellers obtained permission to land, and were received with a hearty welcome by Governor Somerset. As soon as a place suitable for their reception had been found, the scientific instruments were brought on shore, and the usual experiments were made with the pendulum, and the variations of the magnetic needle observed.